We are recording. Natasha, it's really great to have you. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Casey.
So I'll just make a quick introduction for everyone. This is Natasha de Silva, Senior Policy Executive at the Australian Human Rights Commission, based in Sydney. Natasha and I have known each other for, I was thinking about this, it's been like 7 years, 8 years or something like that, which is a long time. This is one of the last of the deep dives. So I'm really excited to end with the work that you guys do in Australia. So I thought we could start with just you letting us know what the Human Rights Commission is, where it sits nationally, what its obligations are internationally, so that we can understand the work that you do.
Sure. Okay, so the Australian Human Rights Commission is a national human rights institution, so that's the term for it. And it's established by legislation, so it's an independent body of government, but curiously it's funded by government. So our independence is written into our legislation. And essentially it's a watchdog agency that exists to provide oversight over government action to ensure that Australia fulfills its obligations under international human rights law. And I'll come back to the question about putting it in the international context. So that's one of our key functions. But we also have the ability to investigate and conciliate complaints of discrimination and human rights breaches for Australians here, and under the law that we administer, which is anti-discrimination law. And then we also have a broader role in terms of educating the community about their rights and how to access their rights. So that's sort of the core function of what we do. So we engage in about 50% of our work is the policy advocacy space, and we've got 8 statutory office holders. We've got a president. We have 7 thematic commissioners who are kind of the outward-facing roles in the commission, who go out into the community, do the speeches, etc., and advocate and work with government, and then a bunch of people who support them in the policy space. And then the other half of our work is around the complaint handling function and trying to conciliate complaints. So that's the role of our commission in terms of where it sits internationally. So about 110 of the 190 nations in the world have a national human rights institution. The United Nations has what's called the Paris Principles that sets out the features of a national human rights institution, and that is things like it should be established independently by legislation or in a constitution, that it's provided adequate funding to undertake its work, that the appointment, it has details about the appointment of commissioners, so that it's a merit-based selection process, and it outlines the kind of powers, so the investigation type piece of human rights issues, that national human rights institutions should have when they're established. So all human rights institutions around the world are accredited within the United Nations system. So every 4 years they're examined to see how they were assessed against those Paris principles. And then we're provided with a status, so A status, B status, according to how consistent the operation is with the Paris principles. And that also means then that we have speaking rights, independent speaking rights at some of the United Nations fora as well. So when our government stands up and says this is the situation at the Human Rights Council, we have an opportunity to give our own view on that. And sometimes there are areas where we'll be very consistent with government, and other times we'll be saying things that not necessarily government wouldn't agree with.
Right.
But that's the independence factor. So it's a really important role. And I think one of the unique things about a human rights institution is that it's neither government, it's not civil society either. So we kind of see ourselves as a bridge between the two as well. We work really closely with civil society. We also work closely with government. And when we're reporting to UN bodies, we'll often consult with and help civil society and consult with them around the kinds of things that we should be talking about and presenting internationally. So yeah, it's a unique role.
What I find astounding is that it's something that the government has agreed to do. That's the part that because there is no, for folks who are in America who are listening to this, there is no equivalent of this in the United States. In fact, the United States does not want a human rights commission on its soil. And I just find it so astounding that, my direct experience is in Australia, that the government has agreed to fund and be accountable to this watchdog. It's amazing. I feel, it makes me feel hopeful that there is a process of accountability that exists. So I always get excited when you break it down. I'm like, tell me more. In all of this darkness, there is hope,
Yeah, it is really interesting. And, Casey, one of the things when we go internationally and speak about work, particularly in the region, we do a lot of work with governments where NHRI's, National Human Rights Institutions, don't exist. There is that real disconnect. Well, why would government fund an independent body to then say what they're doing wrong? Like what? And I can see why that would be the case, but I think there's a part about our democracy, at least in Australia, there's an expectation that, because we're not the only watchdog, of course, there are several, but we're the one that's focused on human rights. Now, as part of our democracy, there is an absolute expectation that watchdogs that form part of that, and you couldn't, even when I think when government, we've been in conflict with government almost, there is still an expectation by the community that a human rights commission will exist. And it essentially comes out of the UN system and the international human rights instruments. And when Australia began to sign up to those, it creates obligations domestic obligations in Australia. And so then that's how we formed. And then once you're part of that system, it's very hard to undo that, fortunately.
I love that. I'm okay with that.
Yeah, same.
So I wanted to know, maybe you could, we'll touch on a couple of things and then kind of do a deeper dive into a report that you all just published. But I guess before we get to that, how do the different inquiries get launched, right? So what is the kind of, how do you as an institution decide, oh, this is the inquiry that we're going to do, this is the investigation that we're going to do?
Sure, it's a good question. And before I come to that, I'll also just note that a national inquiry is actually a specific function of a national human rights institution. So it's one of those unique things that is in the Paris Principles that we have in our legislation that we can undertake. So, and it's a really deep examination of a systemic human rights or discrimination issue. And for us, we've done a number of inquiries over the, 35 years we've been in existence. And there'll be a number of ways, I suppose, in which we might identify an issue. One is through our complaints process. So if we are consistently seeing an issue come up in our complaints process, that will inform whether we think we need. So it's national inquiries are intended to look at an issue that affects a large number of people. So you can't do it at the individual resolution point. So if we're seeing lots of matters come up that are consistent in our complaint handling function, then that speaks to a broader systemic issue, and then we'll do that deeper dive. The other way is that it'll be external factors, an environment that creates, I guess, highlights an issue or brings an issue to a head, and we'll do a national inquiry because of that. Things that we've done, examples of other national inquiries that we've undertaken, pregnancy discrimination at work. So we're getting lots of pregnancy discrimination complaints during the 90s.
Wow.
really consistently and sort of going up. And so we went, okay, there's something we've got to look at, what's going on, why is it happening? And, you know, and pregnancy discrimination at work, I should say. So clearly there was an issue there. People need to be educated about the rights that exist for women who are pregnant. So we did a deep dive into that. We looked at one of the inquiries that were really, I think is really well known, is Bringing Them Home, which looked at the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island children from their families, which is a really powerful inquiry and probably our best known. We also looked at, in the mid-2000s, we looked at children in immigration detention in Australia. That was a very big focus of Australian policy at the time. So we looked at that. We've also looked at same-sex rights under Australian legislation, and the fact that they discriminated and had never been examined before in that way. So a whole range of issues, I suppose. They come up in different ways. The national inquiry that we're going to talk about.
Yeah. So there's this, you know, kind of like this, and I guess my one question to that is that, do most Australian citizens understand that there is a process of complaint that they can go through? Because I've looked at the website and it's actually fairly evident. Like, there's one rubric that's like how to lodge a complaint, which I'm like, I can't believe this is a possibility. This is wonderful. But I wonder, how kind of common knowledge is this that Australians have this as a resource for them?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the answer is, I don't know, but we would say, if people don't know that they can access their rights this way, that there's this remedy process, that's sort of our bad, because we need to be out there saying, these are your rights, this is what you're entitled to. And also for there is also the obligation on people to ensure that, you know, in work, in public areas of life, which is where discrimination is unlawful, that people understand the protection of people's rights as well. So, I mean, I think we do our best to get out there, but I think in reality, my experience is that people don't even think about human rights until they're breached, until they experience discrimination.
Of course.
And then a light goes on, and then, you know, they're on the website and lodging a complaint. And so we're trying to get ahead of that. So how big is our reach? We're always trying to expand.
I love that expansion.
Yep. So we do education in school curriculum, for example. As well as working with the private sector as well. So.
And there are also a lot of interesting webinars that you guys have been doing from this report that we're going to talk about. So let's just like get into it. So you guys did this massive inquiry into sexual harassment in the workplace. I've read the report. It's 1,000 pages long. And I felt so admiring of exactly what you were talking about, which is it is an example of a thorough examination of pointy end of a human rights infraction and how it's affecting Australians in society. And in those 1,000 pages, there are 55 recommendations. I mean, it is a piece of art. Like, if I encourage everyone to at least look at it, because it's amazing and it's so easy to read, of course. But at the beginning of each kind of chapter, there's this like summary bit that I think is surprisingly accessible to a non-specialized person like myself. I was like, oh, I understand. And then, of course, you dive in a little bit and you're like, whoa, that's very technical language that is beyond my profession. But I loved how accessible it was. How long does a process like that take?
Yeah, look, national inquiries can take years. The longer an inquiry goes, and ideally, if you had unlimited resources, most of them would take a couple of years. Unfortunately, the resource in question is the one that determines often how long it will be. But I mean, I'm really grateful to hear you say that particularly those chapter summaries up front are accessible, because that's a really key role for us, you know, is making what we do easily digestible to the population, to anyone who picks it up and reads it. So that's that is great to hear.
Yeah.
So yeah, this national inquiry on sexual harassment in the Australian workplace, the report is called Respect at Work, and it really came about because of the Me Too movement. So this is one of those instances where the external environment created an opportunity and a groundswell for change. So sexual harassment in Australia is unlawful under the Federal Sex Discrimination Act. That is an act that we administer. And, you know, the Act's been in existence since 1984. In fact, it celebrated its 36th anniversary on the weekend, just gone.
Timely. This is perfect.
Right. And so, you know, the Act has been in place, and it's really important Act, you know, making sexual harassment unlawful. But what we've seen over that time is that things haven't shifted. So in terms of the prevalence of sexual harassment, which we've been tracking at the Commission since the early 2000s, we do a periodic prevalence survey sort of every 4 years, and it hasn't changed. The dial hasn't shifted at all. People are still experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace at the same rate. So the Me Too movement really, I guess, created that. It was a catalyst. It created the right environment for us to say, let's do this systemic deep dive into why it is so persistent, why it still exists. Because we know, certainly through our complaint process, the devastating impacts it has on individuals and careers, unsurprisingly. And so it just created that opportunity for us to look at it in this detailed way. So it was 18 months of work. We had a team of about 10 on it. And it was an incredibly, I think, thorough process. So the kinds of things that we do in a process like this is we're trying to hear from as many people as possible. And whether that's individuals who've been affected by who've experienced sexual harassment, or whether it's employees who are trying to deal with it in the workplace, we're keen to hear from as many people as possible. Right. So essentially, we travelled around the country. We went to every capital city in Australia. We went to 2 or 3 regional areas to try and get a different perspective. We had focus groups, you know, town hall type meetings, round tables. We cut our engagement lots of different ways, where we'd speak to men only, we speak to women only. Oh, wow. We speak to different communities within our society. So we had culturally and linguistically diverse consultations. We had Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander consultations. We had consultations with the public service, you know, unions. So it was really, we tried to cut it as many ways as we could to get those different perspectives. And in our report, you can see there's a list of the consultations that we undertook, but it was around 60, I think, around the country, and we spoke to around 600 people. And then we also invite people to provide written submissions. So we had a submission process that was open for many months, and people are invited to write to us about their experience. We received around 450 of those, 500 of those. And then just specific, really targeted consultations with employer groups about, you know, what would work, what if we change the system, you know, how would that affect small business, how would it affect bigger end of town, you know, was there appetite? That doesn't mean if there's no appetite we wouldn't recommend it, but whether there are some barriers that, you know, we hadn't necessarily identified. So it's that piece as well. So the engagement piece is the really critical piece of a national inquiry, trying to hear all those voices, all those perspectives, and understand the impacts. And then the other bit is around the research. So we looked at internationally what was happening. Is anyone, you know, in other countries, are they doing things that we could learn from? Of course, the Me Too movement created a whole lot of activity around the world, separate pieces of work done in different jurisdictions and comparable jurisdictions as well. You know, the question about non-disclosure agreements. So there's a whole range of things about why people experience it, and then what they can do about it. And I think one of the things that we were really keen to understand is we've relied on the individual to come forward to complain. So they've not only experienced the trauma of it, the onus is then on them to bring it forward.
Yeah, right.
And there's a huge disincentive to do that, right?
Right.
It's a burden. You've already, gone through that experience, and then you're the one who has to come forward. So we looked at how you shift that, I suppose, because if you're going to rely on individuals to take on employers in a sense, to actually say this happened to me, to speak out, right. You're probably not going to get much change. And, I guess our laws are evidence of that. Because the prevalence rate is still the same and most people don't complain. So in our most recent prevalence survey in 2018, so a lot of the data you see in this report
that's right.
is from that survey, and 17% of people make a complaint who've experienced sexual harassment. I mean, that's incredibly low and consistent with what we know about sort of gender-based violence anyway. But I think more telling than that is, of those who did complain, 45% said nothing changed in the workplace.
Right.
So a further disincentive to complain if you don't think there's going to be any outcome, because what we know is, particularly in the workplace, most people are wanting change. They don't want this to happen again to them or to happen to a colleague.
Right. Yeah.
It's about wanting that systemic kind of change and their experience to be understood.
This paints a pretty bleak picture. And you said something really interesting. The question was, I wrote it down, why does sexual harassment in the workplace exist? Kind of like, and I wonder, is there anything in the report that speaks to why it hasn't moved at all, right? Because certainly outwardly cultural, kind of like culture writ large, we've moved ahead, things are different, there's, why is it still, I mean, I think I know the answer, I'm like, patriarchy, but I'm like, why is it still
so prevalent?
Yeah,
and I think, yes, I think there are two answers to that. In the report, we talk about the drivers. So one of the things was, what are the drivers of it? Why does it still exist? And absolutely, gender inequality is why it exists.
Right.
The question about that. So even though there are a greater number of women in the workforce, what positions of power are they holding or not holding, I think speaks to that. The type of workforce you're in, whether it's male dominated or not, will impact on that. But I also think, and there'll be others with different views, but I think from what I've seen, my view is that in Australia, we have quite a high tolerance for what, you might consider low level sexual harassment. So that kind of joking, that sexualized jokes, etc., I think is really common. And most people have a very high tolerance for it in Australia. There's a kind of that happens all the time, so you don't say anything. And in fact, when we do our survey, I think this is one of the most interesting things about the survey, is when we undertake it, the question is, have you experienced sexual harassment in the workplace in the last 5 years? And often the respondent will say, no. Okay. Have you experienced any of these 16 behaviours which constitute sexual harassment? They're like, oh, yeah.
Oh my God, yeah.
I mean, what? Hasn't everyone? That's that kind of...
Right.
So there's I guess not even an understanding necessarily that
just
there are these
totally normalized.
Entirely, I think, to a degree.
Right. That's
so part of this process is about educating people about what is sexual harassment, and actually it's not okay to feel awkward or comfortable because someone made a joke,
right?
A sexual joke.
And I guess to add to that is, it's like that awkwardness and discomfort then affects your ability to continue to do the work at a level that, so there's this kind of, even though you don't necessarily feel it yourself, there's an additional kind of burden that's put on you that you then have to overcome as the performer that has been, you know, I don't think there's any sort of mild form of sexual harassment, but to, you know, to kind of the kind that we just kind of come to expect. And it makes me think of, you know, yeah, that's so interesting, because it can, you know, it makes me think of when I was a swimmer and the sexual violence was just prevalent, but none of us would ever say that that was the case because we were just in it. It happened to everyone. And so would any of us say that we'd been raped, or would any of us, I mean, we went to practice with the guys the next day and we kind of knew them, and also it happened to everybody. So it was just this very, I think one of the things when I talk about, you know, sports in particular, which is different, but it was my workplace, right? It's where I worked. And when I talk about the sexual harassment within that workplace for me, because I was getting paid at a really young age, I think about it, I always try to paint the picture of how absolutely normalized it was. And that is the horror of it, that it was just there. And that's interesting that the same finding happened here. Although, you know, for me, again, kind of my sports environment was my work environment, but that's
absolutely. And I actually, yeah, and I don't actually think it's all that different, because as you say, it was your work environment. And so, but it's the power dynamic, right?
Yeah,
so,
right.
You know, if you're a woman in that sport, if you're young, you know, these are all things that combine to mean that you don't feel like you can actually say, hang on a second.
And did you see some of that play out in the data that was found at the end, that there would be kind of like this intersection of a more particularly vulnerable person that was based on being young or being queer, or, you know, is that kind of what ended up?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the intersectionality of disadvantage means that you're more likely to experience. So young workers, for example, just in the workforce, and we know don't have power. I mean, that's just the nature of it in sense. So I think they can be exploited in a number of ways, you know, with respect to labour rights, etc. But I think more vulnerable to sexual harassment because they don't necessarily know that they can actually say not okay.
Right.
So that they're entitled to that safe kind of workplace. They don't know about it. Women with disability, you know, women of different ethnic backgrounds, much more, you know, likely to experience. So yes.
So like I said, so you guys did this beautiful document, and there are 55 recommendations. This is I know it doesn't work this way, but if you had to pick kind of like, if you're in front of, you know, an executive or someone who was at a workplace and you were like, look, if nothing else, do this one, or do these three, or like, if you could pick like a top, I don't know if you can, Natasha. It's okay if you can't.
I don't think I could pick three in that context. I think if you said, what are maybe the three things that if you could implement today, like obviously you've got to implement all 55.
What are the things that you could implement today? Yeah, I was missing that part in the sentence, was like, you're going to implement all 55, but what are the ones you're going to do today?
Yeah, and in the broader scheme. So I think in terms of the structural stuff around workplaces, not necessarily a specific workplace. And I would say it's recommendation 14 around this Workplace Sexual Harassment Council. So and this sounds really kind of dry, but one of the features of our system
is mine. This is so interesting that it's the one that you picked too. Okay. Yeah. Okay, go for it.
So in our system, we have all these regulators, right? So we've got workplace safety, we've got fair work, and human rights. So we're all kind of regulators in the workplace space. And what happens is that in Australia, there are so many that there are different ways you can enter the system to make a complaint about sexual harassment or to kind of address your rights. And so that creates confusion for people. They don't necessarily understand how we intersect with safe work, or how safe work connects with labour rights under our Fair Work Act. So we want to streamline that. We want it so that all the regulators will still exist. We all have a really important role. I think, not everyone can do human rights and not everyone can do workplace rights. So there's a role for all of us. But what we want to do is coordinate more seamlessly, so the no wrong door. So whichever way, whatever happens to you in the workplace, you enter through one of those doors, and that if this isn't the one, that you're referred to referred across seamlessly, and that you get all the support you need, and that you're not repeating your story, all those things we know about good responses. So it's a coordinating of the system that means that we can all be on the same page around not only just that structural, regulator type situation, but also in terms of the materials that we're producing, that they're consistent, that we've got one message about what sexual harassment is, that people understand, so that it's not diluted in any way, I suppose.
Right. Yeah.
We get to understand the drivers, the inequality. People come with us on that journey, and there's that really consistent messaging and learning.
Yeah. No, that's a really, that was the one that I was like, this one should happen now. That's amazing. Natasha, we've spoken for a really long time. I don't want to keep you. You're at the beginning of your day. So I have a couple more questions, and maybe there's more that you want to say, but one of my questions that felt so important to ask you is, could you tell us maybe, sometimes things can feel so daunting, and I think that the work that you do is so important, but you're faced kind of at the front of some pointy ends of some really complicated things. And I'll say this, I know you don't feel this way, but I feel like you're caring for a society in a way that is really so special. But I wonder why you do what you do. Like, what's the thing that keeps you coming back to this very difficult, demanding, rewarding, yes, but arduous work?
Yeah, I think, Casey, you're right. So it is absolutely rewarding, which is the main reason, I think. But I also would say that, the work that we do, while there is the individual complaints, where people, and the work that team does is incredible in terms of assisting people through a process after they've experienced discrimination and human rights breaches. So incredible work that our investigation and complaints team do. For me, working at the policy level, it's much more about the structural change. And I think one of the things when I first went into, into international development, human rights, I thought I wanted to work on the front line. I thought I wanted to, be really on the ground, in development type programs and assisting people. But what I quickly realized is I'm no good at that because I kind of go to pieces, So this is, and so I have enormous admiration for the people who are dealing every day with people who are experiencing disadvantage, discrimination, human rights breaches. And so the place that I can be, where I can be constructive and I hope useful, is at that structural level, the policy level, where you can kind of make those changes and recommendations and advocate for things that will ultimately have an impact and allow people to access and enjoy their rights more fully. But what on the downside, that means it's longer. It's the long term that it's a long game that we're playing, in the sense that, change doesn't come quickly. But yeah, I think it's the right space for me in terms of that. And I have to say the most unique thing about the work and this particular job, and being at the Commission, I've been at the Commission for a number of years, as you know, I've never had a day where I've got out of bed and thought, I can't go in today, I don't want to do this.
So cool.
So it's an enormous privilege. Yeah, I'm very lucky.
That's so great. Natasha, I'm gonna let you go. You have things to do, and the light, it's like literally getting dark here. So thank you so much for your time. I feel so grateful for it. Thank you.
It's such a great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It's so lovely to see you and to speak to you.
Yeah, so I'm gonna hit stop and then we'll say a proper goodbye. So hold on a second.
Thank you.